Welcome, friends. We're so glad to have you here. We've prepared some incredible stories that we hope you'll enjoy. If you do, and you'd like to support the channel and help it grow, please consider subscribing. Your support means the world to us. When I first moved into my old apartment 10 years ago, everything seemed perfect. My name is Emily, and I was 25 at the time. The place was spacious, with modern fixtures, and the highlight was the floor-to-ceiling window in the living room. The window faced another apartment building, and from where I stood, I could see directly into the windows of my neighbors across the street. At first, I thought nothing of it. I worked long hours, and when I came home, I'd pour myself a glass of wine and sit by the window to unwind. Sometimes I'd glance across at the other building. Most of the time, it was just people going about their lives. I found it oddly comforting to see others doing normal things, cooking, watching TV, or talking on the phone. One night, though, I noticed something that made me pause. In one of the windows, a dark silhouette was sitting in a chair. Behind the figure, a TV was on, casting enough light to make the shadow clear. The person seemed to be facing my building. At first, I couldn't tell if they were looking at me or just watching the TV. It felt silly to think they might be staring at me, so I shrugged it off and closed the curtains. The next evening, the same figure was there. Same position, same faint light from the TV behind them. I tried to convince myself they were just watching TV, and it was all in my head. But something about it unsettled me. To test it, I gave a small wave. My heart stopped when the figure waved back. I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. My apartment suddenly felt too quiet, too exposed. I pulled the curtains shut and backed away from the window, my glass of wine shaking in my hand. It was clear now, they were watching me. The following days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I came home, I checked the window. The figure was always there, sitting in the same spot. They never moved. It was as if they were waiting for me. Then I started noticing small, strange things in my apartment. My books weren't where I left them. A mug I'd left on the counter was suddenly in the sink. My jacket, which I always hung by the door, would sometimes be draped over a chair instead. I told myself I was just being forgetful, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I remember one particular night vividly. It was late, and I had just gotten home from a particularly exhausting day at work. I walked into my apartment and immediately noticed something was strange. My apartment smelled faintly of cigarettes. I didn't smoke. The windows were locked, and the door had been bolted just as I'd left it that morning. Yet somehow, it felt like someone had been there. I searched every room, my hands trembling as I clutched a kitchen knife. But nothing was out of place. The shadowy figure across the street became an obsession. I'd sit by the window for hours watching. They never left that chair. Occasionally, I'd see the flicker of movement as their hand adjusted something on the armrest or their head turned slightly. It was maddening. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but I knew deep down that something was wrong. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I called my friend Sarah and asked her to come over. I told her everything, the shadowy figure, the strange movements in my apartment, the overwhelming sense of being watched. She listened patiently and agreed to help me confront the person in the other building. We decided she'd go over and knock on their door while I stayed in my apartment and watched. Sarah walked across the street and disappeared into the other building. I watched her through the window, my heart pounding. She climbed the stairs to the window where the figure always sat. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. After a few minutes, she gave up and came back. "No one answered," she said. "It's probably just some weirdo who doesn't want to be bothered." Her words didn't comfort me. If anything, they made me feel worse. The figure was still there, sitting in the same spot, unmoving. It was like they knew we were trying to confront them and wanted to mess with us. Then, things escalated. I started feeling like someone was following me when I walked home from work. Footsteps echoed behind me, stopping whenever I stopped. One night, I turned around quickly, hoping to catch whoever it was. But the street was empty. Another time, I found scratches on my front door, as if someone had tried to force it open. The police came, took a report, and suggested I install a security camera. But even with the camera, nothing changed. I'd review the footage and see nothing unusual, yet the feeling of being watched never left me. I called the police again after I started finding notes slipped under my door. They were always brief, written in blocky, uneven handwriting. "I see you. You're beautiful. Don't leave." The officers said they'd increase patrols in the area, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and moved out of that apartment. On my last night there, I glanced out the window one final time. The figure was still there, sitting in the same spot, as if they knew I was leaving. I closed the curtains and didn't look back. Even now, 10 years later, I sometimes feel like I'm being watched. When I walk home at night, I can't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I'll never forget that shadowy figure, sitting silently in the window, watching me night after night. My name is Maria, and I'm 32 years old. I live alone in a small, cozy house just outside the city. It's quiet here, which I like. I work from home as a graphic designer, so I'm in the house most of the day. My life is simple, and I like it that way. But last summer, something happened that changed everything, at least for a while. It all started with a jammed lock on my back door. I couldn't open it properly, and it made me feel uneasy. After struggling with it for a few days, I decided to call a locksmith. His name was David, and he came recommended by a neighbor. David seemed pleasant enough at first. He looked to be in his late 40s, with graying hair and a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As he walked in, he immediately began commenting on my house. "Nice place you've got here," he said, glancing around. "Bet it's cozy living alone, huh?" I nodded politely, though his words made me a little uncomfortable. He started working on the lock, fiddling with his tools, and muttering about how some people don't know what they're doing when installing locks. "But not to worry," he added with a grin. "I can fix anything." While he worked, he asked me a series of random, almost intrusive questions. "How long have you lived here? Do you have family nearby? What's your favorite thing about the neighborhood?" I answered vaguely, trying to focus on my work at the kitchen table. After about 30 minutes, he announced that the lock was fixed. I tested it, and while it seemed better, it still stuck a little. "It's probably just old hardware," he said. "I'll come back tomorrow with a better replacement. Don't worry, I'll take care of you." True to his word, David returned the next day with new parts. He spent more time on the lock this time, muttering to himself and occasionally glancing my way. When he finished, the lock worked perfectly. "See? Told you I'd fix it," he said, packing up his tools. "If you ever need anything else, just call me. I can handle all kinds of repairs." "Thank you," I replied with a polite smile, eager for him to leave. Over the next few days, I ran into David a couple of times, once at the supermarket and once while I was out jogging. Each time, he seemed overly friendly. At the supermarket, he waved excitedly and walked over to my cart. "Hey, Maria, stocking up, huh?" he said, peering into my groceries. "Looks like you're a coffee lover. Me too." I laughed nervously and kept the conversation short. Something about him felt weird, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. At the same time, I couldn't deny that there was a strange, almost magnetic quality to his attention. I caught myself wondering if he was lonely or just awkward, and despite my unease, I felt a small twinge of pity for him. But then, things at home started to feel strange. One evening, I noticed that my back door, the one David had worked on, was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. I double-checked and convinced myself I must have been careless. But over the next week, more unsettling things happened. A chair in the living room was moved. My favorite coffee mug disappeared from the kitchen. And one night, I heard faint creaking sounds like someone walking across the floorboards. By now, I was on edge. I decided to install a security camera in the living room, facing the main entryway. For 2 nights, the footage showed nothing unusual. But on the 3rd night, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around 2 a.m., the camera captured movement. A man entered through the back door, quietly and confidently, like he belonged there. He walked into the living room and stood still, staring at the couch for several minutes. Then he moved toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. Thankfully, he didn't enter. After a few more minutes, he left the way he came. I recognized him immediately. It was David. My stomach dropped. He must have made a copy of my house key while working on the lock. That's why he had access. I felt violated and terrified. I knew I had to act quickly, but I was too scared to confront him directly. Instead, I called the police and showed them the footage. The officers took my report seriously and advised me to stay somewhere else while they investigated. I packed a bag and went to stay with my friend Lisa. That night, I barely slept. I couldn't stop thinking about David standing in my living room, his eyes fixed on the couch as if imagining me there. The next day, the police informed me they had located David and brought him in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, but when confronted with the video evidence, he confessed. He admitted to making a copy of my key and letting himself into my house several times. He claimed he was just checking on me and meant no harm, but that didn't make his actions any less horrifying. David was arrested and charged with breaking and entering, as well as stalking. The police assured me he wouldn't be able to bother me again. Still, I knew I needed to take extra precautions. I hired a professional to replace all the locks in my house and installed a comprehensive security system with motion detectors and cameras in every room. It cost a fortune, but I didn't care. My safety was worth it. It was late when I decided to go jogging. The air was cool, and the park near my apartment building was quiet. I loved running at this time. No crowds, just me and my thoughts. The park path wound through trees, the dim streetlights casting long shadows on the ground. It felt peaceful, like the world had paused for a moment. I stretched briefly before starting my jog. My legs moved easily, my feet striking the pavement in a steady rhythm. The faint smell of earth and leaves filled the air, and I let my mind wander. Work had been stressful lately, and running was my escape. The solitude of the park at night felt like a retreat, even if it was a little eerie. The deeper I ran into the park, the quieter it became. The distant hum of traffic faded, leaving only the sounds of my breathing and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. I passed a few empty benches and a small playground, its swings swaying gently in the breeze. It crossed my mind how empty the place was. Not a single other jogger or late-night dog walker. But I pushed the thought aside. I had been here many times before, and nothing bad had ever happened. I had been running for about 20 minutes when I felt a bit winded. I stopped near a bench to catch my breath. Bending forward with my hands on my knees, I took in the stillness. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and my own breathing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were soft at first, almost blending with the natural sounds of the park. I straightened up and looked around. The path was empty. The trees loomed silently, their branches unmoving in the still night air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening, but there was nothing, just silence. A cold feeling crept over me. Maybe it was another jogger. Maybe it was someone walking their dog. That's what I told myself as I started walking down the path. The footsteps started again. This time they were closer. They matched my pace, step for step. I stopped, and they stopped. My heartbeat quickened. I turned my head, scanning the trees and the shadows, but I couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" I said, my voice shaky. No answer. My hands trembled as I began walking again, faster this time. The footsteps behind me sped up too. My breathing grew heavy, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to keep calm, but the sound of someone following me was unmistakable. "I'm not imagining this," I thought. "Someone's there." Panic set in. I broke into a jog, my eyes fixed on the path ahead. The footsteps turned into a run. They were chasing me. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning, my lungs straining for air. The park seemed endless, the path winding endlessly through the dark. I could hear the steps behind me, steady and relentless, like they were gaining on me. "Don't look back, don't stop, just run." The edge of the park came into view. The sight of the street lights and the faint hum of distant traffic filled me with desperate hope. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain in my legs and the ache in my chest. My feet pounded against the pavement, and the footsteps behind me did the same, faster and faster. I burst out of the park and into the street. A cab was parked at the curb, the driver leaning against the door, smoking a cigarette. I waved frantically, shouting, "Taxi!" The driver looked up, startled, and got into the car as I threw open the back door and jumped in. "Drive! Just drive!" I shouted. "Where to?" he asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Anywhere. Just go." He shrugged and pulled away from the curb. My hands were shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I leaned back against the seat, my heart racing. My eyes flicked to the park entrance as we drove past. That's when I saw him. A dark figure stood at the edge of the park, just beyond the light of the street lamp. He was tall, wearing a hooded sweatshirt that hid his face. He didn't move, just stood there, watching as the taxi drove away. I turned away from the window, my stomach churning. My hands didn't stop shaking the entire way home. When I got back to my apartment, I locked the door and checked it twice before collapsing on the couch, still trembling. I haven't been back to the park since, and I've stopped jogging at night. Some things are just not worth the risk. I've always loved working out. My name is Sarah, and I'm 27 years old. It's my escape after a long day. My gym is close to my apartment, so I go almost every evening around 7 p.m. It's usually quiet at that time, with just a few regulars. It always felt like a safe place, until one night everything changed. It started like any other session. I swiped my membership card, grabbed a water bottle, and went straight to the treadmills. I picked my usual spot in the back row, popped in my earbuds, and started my warm-up. About 10 minutes into my run, I noticed someone stepping onto the treadmill next to mine. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man. He was tall and lean, maybe in his mid-30s, with short, dark hair and an intense gaze. I didn't think much of it at first. People often pick machines close to each other. But then I realized he wasn't running. He stood there, looking at me, fiddling with the buttons on his treadmill without starting it. "Hey," he said loudly, cutting through my music. I pulled out one earbud. "Hi," I said quickly, trying to sound polite but uninterested. "You come here a lot, don't you?" he asked. "Yeah, sometimes," I replied, putting my earbud back in, hoping he'd stop talking. Instead, he grinned. "That's dedication. Impressive." "Thanks," I muttered, focusing on the treadmill display. He finally started jogging, but I could feel his eyes on me, even as he ran. Every now and then, I'd glance at the mirror in front of us and catch him staring. After my run, I moved to the weight machines. I hoped he'd move on to another part of the gym, but he stayed close, choosing machines near mine. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I realized he was deliberately following me. Whenever I looked in the mirrors, I'd see him, watching me from different angles. My stomach tightened. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just socially awkward. But then he moved to the stretching area as I finished my set. He wasn't subtle anymore. He kept glancing at me, his movements slow, as if he wasn't there to work out at all. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my water bottle and headed for the locker room, avoiding his gaze. When I left the gym, I didn't look back. It was dark by the time I stepped onto the street. I walked quickly, my gym bag swinging at my side. Halfway home, I had a strange feeling, like someone was behind me. I turned my head slightly and saw a figure walking a short distance behind me. My stomach dropped. It was him. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby, I thought. But when I turned onto my street, he followed. I practically sprinted up the steps to my apartment building, fumbling with my keys before rushing inside. I locked the door and checked all the windows, my heart pounding. For the next few days, I stayed away from the gym. The thought of seeing him again made my skin crawl. I tried to move on, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe he wasn't even following me that night. Then, on the third night, something happened that shattered any sense of safety I had left. It was late, close to midnight, and I was in bed, scrolling through my phone. My apartment has a small backyard, separated by a wooden fence. I don't usually look out at night, but something caught my eye, a shadow moving near the fence. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I turned off my lamp and crept toward the window. Someone was there. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the silhouette of a man standing in the yard, near the edge of the fence. He wasn't moving, just standing there, looking toward my apartment. I couldn't tell if it was the man from the gym, but my gut told me it was him. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called the police. "Someone's in my backyard," I whispered. "Please send someone." The police arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the yard, he was gone. They found footprints near the fence, but no sign of him. After that night, I never went back to that gym. The creep from the gym was never seen again, but the fear he left behind stayed with me. To this day, I don't know if it was really him in my yard or if my mind was playing tricks on me.